Welcome to the second audio case study from the Audience Agency about how to use content to connect better with your audiences and how to organise yourself so that the production of content actually works for you. My name is Richard Leeming. I'm an associate with Gallant Innovation looking at content strategy and digital strategy. And I came to this role after a very long time working as a journalist and digital producer, largely for the BBC. And I'm really delighted to be joined now by a former colleague, Hilary, who I worked with long ago, and I think either of us care to remember. But Hilary, you were doing great things with One Extra, if I remember properly, when we worked together.
And Radio 1. It was a very long time ago, when I was much younger and far cooler than I am now.
And what are you doing now?
So now I'm Director of Digital at Tate, and I'm responsible for all of Tate's digital strategy. And by digital strategy, I mean public-facing, audience-facing digital work. So I don't get involved in the acquisition of digital artworks. Sometimes that's a point of confusion. But my team are responsible for the website and all the content that appears on it and the form and function of the website and the strategic direction we take that in, and then any other sort of interactive experiences that we might have in our galleries when they're open.
Obviously, the Tate has an enormous amount of incredible content. How do you think about telling stories when you're considering your sort of engagement techniques with that content?
Well, we take a very audience-centered approach, and we consider the audience types that we're going for, and we think about what it is that they might need from the content that we're producing, and where are they? So where are they consuming their content already? And then we look at what we have and try to establish what story we can tell. So we're not just about conveying factual or sort of dry academic information. What we're looking for is the story within the artwork or the artist that we're wanting to communicate about. And because really storytelling is sort of at the heart of the human condition. It's how we construct our realities and we construct our sort of societies and our communities around us. And so that's sort of the heartbeat of everything we do as human beings is storytelling. And we're trying very much to tap into that. And in fact, artists themselves are master storytellers. So sometimes they give us a gift, and sometimes we have to wrap other stories around the artwork to help convey the meaning of it.
Can you give me any particularly good examples of how you've used the art of storytelling to explain the artworks in the collection?
My favourites tend to be with our living artists. We have some amazing films around Eliza Nissenbaum, for example, who has painted portraits of NHS key workers during the pandemic as part of an installation at Tate Liverpool. And the film that we've made there is with the artist herself, but also with the subjects. It's an amazing way of making very real and very tangible and very immediate an artwork that is already very pertinent to our times. And we can see that it's resonating with our audiences. Other routes in might be some of our how-to films. So we have things like a film like How to Paint Like Picasso or How to Make a Pot Like Grayson Perry. We're not proposing that within a 3 to 5 minute film, we're actually going to teach you how to paint like a great master. But the point of the film is that in learning how these artists create their works or through their signature methods, you're learning about their materials and their skill. You're learning something about how they look and their approach. You're sort of approaching the artwork and the themes of the art from a more oblique angle and an angle of craft, which is telling a story in itself about how these artworks are made, as well as the ideas behind the artworks. And I think they're a fantastic entry point. You
mentioned just then that you can see that the audience are responding to them. I mean, can you give me some examples of how the audiences have responded to them? What sort of feedback do you get?
It's mostly in comments. It's mostly in good old social media. So we see some amazing comments. We have a YouTube channel that is very regularly updated. That's where all of our films are, and as well as on our owned channels. And we crop most of our films for Instagram. They'll appear there as well as in Facebook and Twitter. But Instagram's a primary venue for this kind of content. And generally the comments and the discussions that happen around them are extremely encouraging. And we look at that, that's a factor we take into account when we're considering what to make more of and making decisions about content strategy in ourselves. There are clues in those comments quite often.
So it's a virtuous circle then,
Yeah.
in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, there's there are other stories that we tell. We tell stories using the data that we get from how our content is consumed, and those are stories that we tell internally to our stakeholders and our colleagues in other departments who don't have access to this kind of sort of coalface of interaction with audiences, to share those insights with them and to make sure, everybody's on the same journey about what stories we're telling and how and why and how they're reaching people and how they're landing with our audiences.
I mean, that's an interesting point to dive into. Is this something that the curators and the experts in other departments see as a valuable resource, or is it something that maybe they're a little bit threatened by?
I think it's growing in value for very many people who aren't like us and working in digital day in, day out. This was new territory. It's fairly established now. I mean, it's taken as part of a mix of data points, really. So it's very valuable insight, and we take it on board in the same way that we take on board insights from our visitors to our galleries, who we also survey about the content and storytelling that takes place inside our galleries. It's part of a quite rich picture of insight that we try to develop and use to build our offer across everything we do.
And how are you organised as departments to deliver this? If you go back and look at the workflows and the who has responsibilities, is this something that you drew on from your days working for a broadcaster in those sorts of structures to make sure that this all works efficiently?
The thing I drew on from most of all, actually, from my days in the broadcaster was a focused attention to audience and making content for a specific audience rather than trying to make content for everybody. Because if you try and make content for everybody, you sort of hit nobody. You've got to focus in. And actually, when you focus in, you then build halo effects around that of audiences who are interested. So I began with a quite simple digital audience strategy, because when I arrived at Tate, we didn't have one. So that's where we began. And then the next thing that I built on, again, from my days at the Beeb, was the sense of a project lifecycle that starts with the creative thinking and ends with measuring your output and learning from what you've just done to build on it the next time. It's a reflection of the sort of radio production environment I was in, but also, frankly, the digital production environment I'm in. You see that method in Agile, that sort of cycle of develop, release, test, learn, feedback into the loop.
Glad you mentioned radio there, because for me, also coming from a radio background, I think that idea where you started everything with a meeting where ideas were drawn from as wide a spectrum as possible. I mean, is that something that you replicate at the Tate? We
try to. We've got lots and lots of stakeholders, and Tate is an incredibly creative organisation, so we don't lack for ideas. Sometimes the challenge for us is filtering through those ideas to find the really good ones or the workable ones. We draw on input from our colleagues, and at ideas stage, we'll be talking to colleagues outside the digital department, primarily curators and our learning colleagues. We focus on where the work is originating. So if it's with an exhibition, it'll be with the curators. If it's more of a learning event, it'll be with the learning curators. And we try to draw on their expertise as much as we possibly can. But we also look outside the organisation. We're always looking externally for inspiration of how people are creating content, and we're looking within our sector but also outside our sector to look at what's happening on YouTube in general. What are the trends for content production? What's happening in podcasts? Is there anything we can learn there? And we're mindful that we're on much smaller budgets frequently than lots of the people we would consider not our competitors, but we like to compare ourselves to, or at least learn from. So sometimes it's about taking a spirit or an ethos rather than directly trying to replicate something that somebody else has done.
There's two things in that answer I want to pick up on, so I'll ask you two questions. The first one is, you've mainly mentioned films, but there you talked about podcasts. Are you mainly concentrating on films and Instagram and YouTube, or are there other content platforms as well?
It's mostly visual. We're a visual arts organisation, but also it's mostly visual because that's where we see the greatest impact in terms of audience figures and audience engagement. We do have a small but very rich podcast library that we would like to grow on, but sometimes that's just a question of, when you have limited resources, about focusing your attention where you're going to have the greatest impact at any one time. But we've had some beautiful podcasts made, and it's something that I would like us to return to when we're able to. But at the moment, what we're seeing is hunger for visual content, and the greatest consumption channels have been via Instagram and then YouTube. So we're going to where our audiences are, and what they're wanting to watch is film.
And you mentioned budgets. How do you meet that budget challenge?
We have worked very hard for a very long time to meet that. This is probably an unhelpful answer for departments or teams who are embarking on this now, because actually we're able to make some very, very high quality content that we shouldn't by rights be able to make for the budgets we have. But the reason we are is because we have grown those skills over time. We don't make everything in-house. We work with very talented external partners, but we sort of blend it. We have some in-house capacity. We do all our production ourselves. So this is a lot of experience that's built up over time. But I would say if anybody's wanting to start out on this, is to begin is the best thing you can do. And keep as much of the expertise as you can, or as much of the learning as you can in-house. So try not to outsource all of your production if you can. If there's somebody within your organization who wants to make stuff, see if you can enable them to make it as best as they can and learn from that, because that's how the organization will learn. If we commission and we only commission, then we don't get these kinds of economies of scale of learning and then being able to develop really great stuff quickly as well, being able to turn things around, being able to grow that sort of instinctive muscle that grows from knowledge, where you can look at something and go, I don't think that's going to work. Or you have a situation like lockdown and you're able to think, okay, how are we going to do this? Because we've learned enough from how we've done this pre-lockdown. How are we going to adapt to this? And what are the new skills we're going to need to grow? And what are the skills that we're going to need to lean on heavily to make this happen?
Well, you just anticipated my next question. We're talking about this in January 2021. We're just embarking on the second, or is it the third lockdown? I mean, it depends, I suppose, where people are in the country. And so did you radically change your approach when lockdown happened in April 2020? And have you changed it again now that 2021 is upon us?
I'll answer those in reverse. I suppose we're refining it now. We're in London, we're in lockdown 3, but we have been working remotely since March. So for nearly a year, the digital department never did go back into the office. And when the first lockdown began, March 2020, our first adaptation was to very, very quickly work out, of the films we had in pre-production and production, how many of them could we continue with? And also to turn around within 24 hours notice, film shoots for 2 of our exhibitions that were closing. And how can we do that, observing the social distancing guidelines that we had at the time, and bearing in mind that was the time of possibly greatest ambiguity, because nobody really understood. We know a great deal more now about what coronavirus is and how it spreads and everything else. So there's a very talented producer in my team who turned that around on a moment's notice, and went into the gallery with social distancing guidelines in place, closed gallery, no members of the public in there, the crew, absolute bare minimum crew, everybody masked up, everybody at a distance, and managed to film very beautiful tours through to exhibitions that the public would now no longer be able to see. So that was one adaptation. We've experimented with other things. So other things have happened through our social media channels. We had a security guard film. There's a gardener at the Barbara Hepworth Gardens in St. Ives who was able to do a little bit of a tour of the gardens and talk about those a bit, and particularly at sort of springtime when everybody was thinking about going outside a bit more. We've also done things like send filming equipment, mostly iPhones, to artists so that they can film themselves and send the footage back, which are then edited in. So we've been adapting our production methods, and that sort of requires a bit of an adaptation of the sort of film we're making, and that continues. That's going to be an ongoing process for the foreseeable future, really, because even as we emerge from lockdown, there'll be things that we want to save from this. We don't necessarily need to send crews to distant locations anymore. There are things that we've learned from this that we'll want to carry with us.
So finally, because we've both got homeschooling responsibilities that are probably going to be, neither of us have been interrupted just yet.
Which is a minor miracle.
Yeah, it is. It's quite astonishing. Obviously, content platforms iterate all the time, and there is the challenge of 3D, 360, virtual reality, augmented reality. Are these ideas that cross your path every day, and how do you respond when someone comes in with a really
So yes, first of all, yes, they are across my path. And yes, I do get proposals. There was a big flurry of proposals for virtual reality exhibitions in March last year, which is sort of unsurprising in retrospect. How I address them is through several lenses. The first one is audience first. We need to think about the audiences we have as an organisation. And as we hold the nation's art collection on behalf of the British people, we have a responsibility to share it with them as best we can and across as many platforms as we can. So a VR proposition, for example, that requires really expensive gear at home, really expensive headset, is not accessible to the majority of people. I'm always interested in emerging tech. I'm interested in them as signals of the future about where we might go. I'm really interested in what other people do with them, but we may not always jump on them early doors. We have experimented with VR in the gallery, and we had a great success with one installation in an exhibition. And we learned a lot from that about what we might do with those technologies. But now, in the circumstances we're in, it's got to fit for where we are today. That's no longer appropriate. What we're looking for now is, what do people have in their homes and in their hands and in their pockets? How are they using those devices? What are they using them for? And how do we engage with them? How can we reach them? And what are the emerging technologies that help us do that? So at the moment, I think there's some interesting work around augmented reality. We're seeing lots of stuff in retail about people being able to put sofas in their homes and see what they look like. I think that's kind of interesting. I'm curious to see where that goes and what we might do with in playful terms around that. So yeah, I suppose I look at it from an audience lens, from our perspective of needing to reach as many people as possible. Of course, I'm looking at it through the art lens as well, about what is actually an authentic representation of the art in the way that we would wish people to understand it and engage with it. It shouldn't be a free-for-all. Are we helping people to engage and connect, which is part of our mission? It shouldn't be just a sort of a gratuitous bells and whistles, pizzazz, flashy thing. It's got to be meaningful, and it's got to help us deliver on our mission. And then, is it something that will deliver sufficient impact at sufficient scale for the amount it will cost us in either effort or public money to do? As a public organisation, we are responsible for how we do things.
So you've got a pretty clear framework there for assessing new content ideas, which plays into a lot of different demands on you. Right, well, we've been chatting now for a long time, and this has been really, really enlightening, and I'm incredibly grateful to you for being so open and giving us such good insight to how you use content at the Tate. So, Hilary, thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure.